All right, so this is week 2 of Advanced Server-Side Programming, COMP2106. So just so everyone knows, I now have access to Blackboard. I sent you a notification just to let you guys know. I'm going to quickly go over Lab 1, probably just before I let you guys out for a quick break. So that will be due Thursday before next class at midnight. Originally, it was going to be due last Thursday, or yesterday, but again, I didn't have access and I didn't feel it would be fair for you guys. So that will be, again, due Wednesday at midnight. So last week, for those of you that weren't here, we just did kind of a refresher on JavaScript, making sure that we had Node.js installed on our machines. So for any of you that do not have Node.js installed on your machine, just install the latest LTS. I believe in the YouTube video that was posted for the course, I am recording all classes, so you can just watch the videos if you need a quick refresher on how I did something, but we just installed Node.js on our machines. So for this class, it's going to be a quick introduction to JavaScript. I know the majority of you already do have experience with JavaScript, so we're just going to quickly go over that. As well as for those of you who have not joined the Slack, it's under, actually, hold on, let me just show you. It's on Blackboard. It's going to be probably the easiest means of communicating with me, especially when we're in class. So if there's any questions and you don't feel like putting up your hand and interrupting, or if you want to be able to quickly reach me outside of class hours, you can just shoot a message to me or in the group. It's for those of you that do not know, Slack is kind of like a collaboration tool. It's a communication program that's pretty common in the workplace. So for those of you that do not know it, you probably, chances are going to be using it in the workplace. So if you want to join the Slack channel, it's just under Tools and Resources. And right here is the Slack invite link. So you just open it, you'll register with your username and password, and because I'm already logged in, it just redirects me to it. So there's a web version as well as a desktop application and mobile application. So any device that you have will most likely be able to use it. So with that being said, let's do some intro to JavaScript. So JavaScript statements, it's very similar to Java, if any of you guys that have used that before. I know we have a couple of computer programmers who have used it. Because you guys are web, have you, any of the web programmers used Java before? No, okay, so this is pretty useless, but you guys have used JavaScript before. So the white space refers to the spaces, tab characters, and return characters in the code, and it's ignored by the compiler. So there are sometimes preferences on if you use tabs or spaces in your programming. It doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, it gets compiled the same. So with that, it doesn't matter. In some cases, JavaScript will try to correct what it thinks is a missing semicolon by adding a semicolon at the end of a split line. This can be seen when you use the return statement, and then on the next line, you end up returning what you want. But because return is on one line by itself, it actually will return nothing. So we can kind of go over that. Really, the best way is whenever you're done a statement is to always end it in a semicolon. So in here, JavaScript is case sensitive. So if you have two different variable names that are named the exact same with different capitalization, those are two different things. It also ignores extra white space within statements, and each JavaScript statement ends with a semicolon. Again, it's not forced to do it, but it is best practice to do so. When you split a statement over 2 or more lines, there's a couple different things that you can do. So you can do arithmetic, equals, greater than, less than, same sort of comparisons that you guys have been using, as well as any sort of addition, multiplication, etc. An opening brace, curly, square, doesn't really matter. And then there's some things for not to split a statement over. So an identifier, a value, or the return keyword. The return keyword is pretty common, as you guys have seen in programming. And if you do that, like I said, you will sometimes get into an error that you might not know what's going on. And then closing brace. So how do we create identifiers? So identifiers are the names given to variables, functions, objects, properties, and methods. JavaScript, unlike some other languages, has some interesting ways that you can create identifiers, specifically dealing with functions, but we'll get into that later. In camel casing, all of the words within an identifier except for the first word start with capital letters. So this is pretty common when you guys are using variables. The first letter will be lowercase and every other word will be capitalized for your variables, as well as functions. So identifiers can only contain letters, numbers, underscore, and the $sign. They also cannot start with a number. As I mentioned before, they're case sensitive, can be any length, and can't be the same as a reserved word. So reserved words are words in a language that are predetermined that you can't use, such as, class, return, other words like that, that when you're using them in the language usually mean that you're doing some sort of function in it. So you can't name a variable for, because that would usually indicate that you're using a for loop. And then there's also global properties and methods as identifiers. If you're using one of them, you won't be able to use the global property or method with the same name. So that is more for front end, which we can go over. So how do you create an identifier? So here is a list of some valid identifiers in JavaScript: subtotal, tax rate, index 1, calculate, click, and log. Camel casing versus underscore notation. So on the left you can see, well, in this case I'm using a font that is putting it all into capitals, so that's not super useful, but let me change that. Just throw it into that. Okay. So this might be a little more helpful. So as you can see, tax rate on the left, tax is lowercase with rate with a capital R, as opposed to the right where it's separated by an underscore. So typically in JavaScript, we will use the camel case, but really there's no enforcement. You are welcome to use an underscore. It's not wrong. It's just so that way when you're working with other programmers who are using the same kind of best practices, you're not going to get yelled at by your peers. So naming recommendations. So I'm sure as you guys have seen, sometimes it can be a little difficult to figure out the name of a variable, and they are pretty important. There are sometimes cases where you will use something that is not as helpful but is still commonly known, such as for a for loop when you're using an index. Usually you just use I, but of course you can use whatever you want. The main important thing is that you're consistent. So either use camel case or use underscores. Don't mix them, stick with one. That's usually best practice. And if you're using underscore notation, use lowercase. So as I mentioned, there's a bunch of reserved words in the JavaScript language, and this is a big table of all of them. There's probably some others. Seems pretty updated with some of the newer keywords that are in there. But these are all different words that if you were to type them into your text editor, would probably show up with a different color to indicate that you're using a reserved keyword. So how do you use objects, methods, and properties? An object has methods that perform functions that are related to the object, as well as properties that represent the data or attributes that are associated with the object. That probably sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo. When you call a method, you may need to pass one or more parameters to it by coding them with the parentheses around the method name separated by commas. So when you guys use a function, you can give it multiple parameters that is a comma-separated list of what you're wanting to do. So each variable that you're giving as a parameter needs to be separated by a comma. You guys probably know this by now. The window object is the global object for JavaScript, and JavaScript lets you omit the object name and dot parameter period when referring to the window object. So for when you guys are working with front-end JavaScript, there's the window object that you can usually use it to grab a lot of different information about the browser. When you declare a variable, it attaches it automatically to the window object. So when you're referencing variables, you actually don't have to do window dot. However, when we start working with Node.js on the server, it's a little bit different because you don't have a window. It's running on the server. So the syntax for calling a method of an object will be the object name dot method name and then parameters. So again, pretty similar to most different programming languages. Has a very similar syntax because if you were to bring in a new syntax, it might be a little bit difficult for people to use it. Primitive data types are number equals 1, and it's a 1. An integer is a whole number, and a decimal value can have one or more decimal positions to the right of the decimal point. So unlike some other programming languages, there's not actually a difference between an integer and what you might know as a float or a double. There's no difference. It's just a number in JavaScript. And there is a way to tell the difference between a whole number and a decimal number. But at the end of the day, it's just a number. It doesn't really matter. If a result is stored in a number data type that is larger or smaller than the data type can store, it will be stored in a value infinity or negative infinity. Then there's the Boolean data type, which is used to represent a Boolean value of either true or false. Floating point numbers are decimal values stored as a floating point number. In that format, a number consists of a positive or negative sign. Again, I kind of just mentioned this with number. It's pretty much the same. String, as you guys know, is a sequence of characters that can be really anything, followed by starting with a quotation, ending in a quotation of the same thing. So you can have a single quote, double quote, as well as using a backtick in JavaScript, which is the character that is right beside your 1 key. An empty string is a string that contains no characters. It is entered by typing 2 quotation marks with nothing between them. How to code numeric expressions. To code a numeric expression, you can use the arithmetic operators to operate on 2 or more values. The modulus operator returns the remainder of a division operation. An arithmetic expression is evaluated based on the order of precedence of the operators. To override the order of precedence, you can use parentheses. I'm sure you guys all know this from school when you learned BEDMAS. So it takes the exact same thing. So here's a quick showing how you can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, blah, 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 blah. So,
quick question. Will this PowerPoint be available on Blackboard after this lecture?
Yes. I believe it already is. If not, it might just be hidden, as well as, of course, you can just go through it in the YouTube video. But I believe it's already, I'll just put it up there because I know some people like to follow along.
Well, all we know is like what we do. It only has the online JS console, practice, and the rate solution.
All right, double check. Now it's there. It'll be called Intro to JavaScript. So how do you work with numeric variables? A variable stores a value that can change as the program executes. To declare a variable, code the keyword var and a variable name, as well as in JavaScript, there are 2 other ways to declare a variable. As of ES5, you can use either the word let or the word const. A const is a value where its data type cannot change, as opposed to some other programming languages where the value itself cannot change. So, well, again, that's a little bit different. If you create an array or an object, the values inside of that array or object are able to change with a const, whereas if you created, say, a number or a string, that value is not able to change. With an expression, a numeric literal is a valid integer or decimal number that isn't enclosed in quotation marks. So a valid number is not a string value of 100, but actually just 100. To assign a value to a variable, you use the assignment statement that consists of the variable name, an assignment operator, and an expression. So you can just do, var literal equals this, and then you can reassign it to that or anything that you want. You guys have created variables. If there's not, anyone stick up your hand and let me know if you have not created a variable before. So here's some quick examples using the keyword var. Var is the older way of creating variables inside JavaScript and will automatically attach that variable to the window object when on the front end, as I mentioned. When you use const and let, it does not attach it to the window, which for most cases, you guys aren't going to actually notice a difference. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. So as you can see at the top, we declared one variable, 3 variables. Don't declare it like that. If you're going to declare multiple variables, do it on new lines with new var. The second one is an assignment, and then some multiplication done on a variable, reassigning a variable, and doing addition on it. If there's any more questions, either look at that or feel free to ask later. How to work with string and Boolean variables. To assign values to string variables, you can use the plus or plus equals variables, just as you would use them with numeric variables. To concat 2 strings, you can just do it with the plus operator. Within an expression, a string literal is enclosed in quotation marks. To escape sequences can be used to insert special characters. So in the case of the one at the bottom, they use a backtick, meaning that I actually specifically want that character. If you were to use a single quote, it would usually end that string, but what it does is it says, no, I actually want this character, don't end the string. This case is not a great example because it's already using double quotes, but you can kind of get if you're having to use a string and you want to use the exact same character. So these are some common escape sequences. It doesn't necessarily have to be a double quotation or a single quotation. You can use \n for a new line, \b for backspace, \0 for a null character, horizontal tab, vertical tab, and an actual literal backslash. So how do you use the, I think that's supposed to say parse int and parse float methods. So because in JavaScript, you don't necessarily have typed variables. So sometimes you might have a value that is a string but actually is a number. So you will take that variable and parse int it in order to get an actual number object for it. So the window object provides parse int and parse float methods for you that lets you convert string values to integers or decimal values. When you use the prompt method or a text box to get a numeric data that you're going to use in calculations, you need to use either parse int or parse float method to convert the string data to a numeric data. When you're using inputs in Java or in HTML, when you do a form submission, everything by default is always a string. That's just kind of how it is when you're using an input. So I'm sure if you guys before have a drop down, like a select, and you have the values of each option, those values are always going to be a string. Even if you just do value equals 2, it's going to be a string. So you need to parse int it. So if you end up using parse int or parse float on something that is not a number, it returns NaN, meaning not a number. It's returned by the parse int and parse float methods when the value that's being parsed isn't a number. When working with methods, you can embed one method in the parameter of another. This is sometimes referred as object chaining. So there are the methods parse int and parse float, has a quick description of each. Both return not a number if it's not a number, and one returns an integer, one returns a decimal. How to code conditional expressions. Conditional expression uses the relational operators to compare the results of two expressions. A compound conditional expression joins two or more conditional expressions using the logical operators. The isNotANumber method tests whether a string can be converted to a number. It returns true if the string is not a number and false if the string is a number. So as you guys know with your if statements, an if statement has to have some sort of condition in it that either evaluates to true or false. So in these cases, you can do less than equal to, greater than equal to, not equal to, and equal. As well as there are some other ones. As I said, there's also modulus and other stuff like that. How the logical operators work. So both tests and the AND operator must be true for the overall test to be true. So if you're testing two different things, and you use the double ampersand for AND, both values have to equate to true. Use or, one or both can be true for it to be true, and then there's also not. So here is a quick example of how to do an if statement. It's kind of really tiny, it might be hard to see, but you guys know what an if statement looks like. So you have an if followed by if you want another else if, or another else if, and then an else statement. How to do code while and do while loops. So would anybody like to tell me the difference between a while or a do-while loop? Anybody is welcome to.
Well, a while loop means while the condition is true, perform whatever code is in the block. And a do-while loop means do this, and then if the condition remains true, continue running the code in the block. So one will run it no matter what, and the other only runs it if it meets the condition.
Correct. So the while loop will check the condition before it executes any code in between the parentheses. And then a do-while loop will execute all of the code one time, then check the condition. And if that condition is still true, it will then execute it additional times until it becomes false. So a do-while loop is pretty good if you're wanting to request information from the user one time. And then if it does not meet certain conditions, then you can continue to ask that user for more information. Whereas a while, doesn't necessarily have to be run. So how to code a for loop? So for loop is like in every other language. It has the counter initialization, a condition, and then an increment expression. There are some other ways that you can do for loops in JavaScript. You can also do a for in loop, but we won't really get into that for all states and purposes. We're just going to use this for loop. So in this case, you would have like for var equals 0, I is less than 10, I++, and that means that it will execute whatever is in the parentheses, and then every single time that that is done, it will do the increment operation, in this case, additioning 1 to I. So this is pretty good if you have, if you want to run it for a certain amount of times. If you're trying to say you have 10 items that you want to loop over, you can loop over the length of those items, just because then that way if you don't know how much stuff is going to be, but it's like an actual number, it's usually best to use a for loop. So how do you work with objects, functions, and events? So as I said in last week's class, that JavaScript is an event-driven language, as well as a partial functional programming language. So in this case, you can create a date object and assign it to a variable using the syntax below, and then you can use the date methods after you have assigned it. So when you declare a string variable, a string object is automatically created, and then you can use the string methods, very similar between string and date. So the date, here are a couple methods for date, a couple methods for string. So again, once you declare that variable, you can then use the different methods that are for that. So here's a quick example. So this one is creating a data object. It's supposed to say date. And then you can use toDateString, get full year, get data, get month, etc., as well as a string. So how to create and call an anonymous function. So in JavaScript, there are different ways, as I mentioned, to create a function. One of those is an anonymous function. Anonymous function being that it doesn't actually have a name, like you guys would see in some other programming languages. But in this case, we actually assign a variable to an anonymous function. So in this case, it's basically like you have a named function, except it's assigned to a variable that you can execute later. So as you can see down below, we've created a function that doesn't have any name, that takes a value called parameters. And then we assign it to a variable called variable name. And if you were to execute variable name, it would run whatever code is inside of there. So a function can require that one or more parameters be passed, blah, blah, blah. An anonymous function is one that is coded as shown below. Technically, the function has no name, but it's stored in a variable, and it is referenced by the variable name. In JavaScript, for an application, an anonymous function must be coded before any statements that call it. Otherwise, an error will occur. So in JavaScript, there is something that is called hoisting. So when you create a variable and a function, there are certain ways that JavaScript will compile that. So if you create a variable with the keyword var at the bottom of your document, it will automatically actually reference it at the very top, but will not do assignment until later on. Same thing with functions that are named. It will also hoist those up to the top, so that way you can reference them in your code. However, in this case, if you have a named one, it will not do that. So here's some function examples where we have a variable called showYear that creates a new date called today, and then it uses the alert keyword to get the full year. Some more examples of anonymous functions here. So how to create and call a named function. So a named function is one that is coded as shown below. This is just another way to code functions. So in this case, instead of having the word function followed by the opening braces, we actually have a name, so that way we can reference it later on. A named function with no parameters doesn't return a value. So that's just an example of one that's not returning a value because it doesn't need to. When and how to use local and global variables. For the most part, you don't really need to use global variables, but this comes into the scope of a variable. So scope of a variable or function determines what code has access to it. Variables that are created inside a function are considered local and will be deleted from memory upon that function ending. Variables that are created outside functions are considered global, meaning that anything is able to have access to it. If you forget to code the var keyword in a variable declaration, JavaScript engine assumes that the variable is global. This can cause debugging problems. In general, it's better to pass local variables from one function to another as parameters than it is to use global variables, as it'll make your code easier to understand with less chance for errors. So typically, if you guys have a global variable and you end up executing code that is changing that global variable, it can be what is called a side effect, where you don't necessarily know that it is changing something that is outside of it. If you have, if you're ever dealing with manipulating data in any sense, either addition or complex calculations, if it is not already, if a variable is in a certain state and you need to do calculations on it, it should be passed to it as a parameter. Otherwise, it should be declared within the function, and if it's not used, it doesn't need to be returned. But when that function is done executing, it is deleted from memory. Because otherwise, it can make following the chain of where that variable exists a little bit difficult. So how to work with arrays. So array is able to store one or more elements in JavaScript. An array doesn't necessarily have to have all of the same types in it, unlike other programming languages. But an array does have a length of how many elements are inside of it. So one way to create an array is to use the new keyword, or you can just use, at the bottom there, using the brackets literal. So an array is made of 2 square brackets, and then you can put stuff inside of it. So how do you add and delete array elements? So one way is that you can use concat or other different functions that are available, as well as you can just add it in, which I will show you in a quick sec by referencing the number. So one thing that you can do here is we have an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, and in here we do numbers of the numbers.length equals 5. So because arrays start at 0 in JavaScript, the length will say 4, but the indexes of those is 0, 1, 2, and 3. So in this case, if you wanted to append something to it, you can do numbers.length equals 5, and then when you console log it, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you end up, in the second example, as you can see, if you end up referencing an index that is greater than what its length is, it will automatically put in undefined for the differences between it. And then you can also delete something from memory by using delete and referencing the exact element in the array. So, how to use for loops to work with arrays. As I mentioned earlier, you can use a for loop and use numbers.length to iterate over the array. We're going to be using some better ways of dealing with this that are a little more semantic and make more sense. We're going to be using for each and map over an array because it just makes more sense. So, but here is an example of how you can do it before. As I mentioned, there's also a for in loop where you can loop over every element that is in an array. Typically, it's just easier to use a for each loop, which we will go over. How to use the methods of an array object. So as I said, you can add stuff to an array as well at the end if you wanted to use .push. .pop removes the last element. Automatically, it'll decrement the length and return the element that was removed. You can use unshift, shift, join, toString. Really, a lot of these are not, at least I don't really use them. But there are ways of working with arrays. As I said, JavaScript is constantly evolving. So they've added some new ways of being able to append to it that personally, in my opinion, just make it a little bit easier. But
I've used it a few times.
yeah. So here's a quick example of being able to push into an array. So you can push an unlimited amount of values into an array. So in the first case, we have a variable called names of Mike, Ann, and Joel. Then we use names.push, and we give it Ray, as well as give it Tom. So then that will make it Mike, Ann, Joel, Ray, and Tom. Then we can use pop, and we store that value into the remove name. As I said before, it will remove the last element in the array, and then we can alert and just see that that would be Tom. And then we can also use .join. So .join will take all of the elements that are in an array and just turn it into a string, usually by default. So you can also use .join and give it a value if you wanted to separate it. So if you wanted to, in that example that's right there, it's not really the best because it automatically put a comma into it. But if you wanted to separate it by dashes or anything else, you could do that. So to use unshift, this is where if you wanted to like put certain elements in a certain location in the array. So in this case, it uses unshift and it puts in Ray and Tom again. In this case, instead of being put at the end, it actually put it at the beginning. And then by not specifying anything on shift, it removed Ray, who was at the very beginning. And then, as I said, you can see that it removed it from the array. A lot of these you probably won't be using, or at least using as much. So that's the end of that. So that was just a quick going over JavaScript. You guys have used it before, but if there's any questions, now would be a good time to quickly go over it if you have any confusion on how JavaScript works. Is there any questions? Cool. Hands up if anyone has already seen that slide. Yeah, I apologize if you've seen it. Okay. So what we're also going to be working with is Node.js. And as I mentioned in last week's class, Node.js is using the V8 engine of JavaScript created by the Chrome team on the server. So you're able to execute JavaScript code without having to have a browser, which is pretty good for when you're starting to work in full stack environments where you have people that are on the front end who are now able to write code that is on the back end without having to learn another programming language. So is there anyone here who does not have Node.js installed on their machine? Show of hands if you don't have Node.js installed. I'm going to be attempting to use this online tool that's called Code Sandbox. For those of you who have not used it, it's pretty good. You can write some front-end code and just have an editor inside of your browser. I'm going to be using it just to share the code with you that I'm going to be writing, so that way you guys have live access to whatever I'm writing up here. So in here, you can create a node server template. Now you guys can just use your browser, or not your browser, your editor on your machine, like VS Code or some sort of thing like that. But this will just make it a little bit easier to share that with you. Although every single time I save, okay, it seems to be good. It kept making it a front-end application, which it shouldn't be. So I'm just going to put this onto Blackboard for you guys. Oh, not that one. a web link. Okay, so at the top of week 2, I put access to the live code. If you can't see it, just give me a heads up, because I have not used this before. Hopefully it's still working. Reloading too fast.
So I need to sign in to join the session.
Yeah, you'll probably have to sign in with your GitHub account, which I believe almost everyone does have a GitHub account by now. So in here, let me hide that. Nope. There we go. Okay. So last week we used the HTTP module that is provided by Node.js in order to create a web server. So in this case, we use HTTP. Oh, yep. It must have created a new one when I refreshed. Let me edit that. Oh.
Okay, this is weird. It says something went wrong. It seems like the session doesn't exist or has been closed.
Yeah, just try refreshing it and seeing if it works now. So I can see some people have joined.
Nope, I'm still not in here.
Did you refresh Blackboard in order to see a new link? I just posted it up there.
Wait,
I have some people joining, so.
okay, basically I clicked on the link for live code, but nothing seems to be happening. I've signed in with my GitHub account, but this keeps happening.
to Blackboard?
Yeah,
And refresh?
this is the third time I refreshed.
Right click on it. Just time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So as I said, was just saying, we use the HTTP module that is provided by Node.js in order to create a web server. So on .createServer is a function that is provided in the HTTP module that you then give what is called a callback. So a callback is when you give it a function to execute when it is done doing that. So in this case, we have function that has two parameters that are called REQ and RES. So just to make it a little bit easier to understand for those of you who weren't here last week. So the first parameter is a request. So that is what is being sent from the user. So if you loaded up a web page, you would be the user that's requesting a site, and then respond, or I guess response would be a better. So response being what is going to be sent back to the user. So in this case, we end up writing hello world, and then we end the connection. And then down here is just listing on port 8080. That is just really whatever port you're going to be opening up on your computer. So that way you can access it. So as you can see, I have hello world right here in my sandbox. So if I wanted to, so as I've mentioned before, we're going to be using a module that's called Express, which wraps around the HTTP module and makes it pretty easy to be able to work with. If you are unfamiliar with it, so this is the website for Express. It's expressjs.com. And they do have a lot of guides of getting started with it and being able to use it on your computers for the first time. So this kind of goes over creating your project, using npm init, which as I said last week, will create that packages.json folder that allows you to manage all of your dependencies in the application. Entry point, which is where your default application is going to start. And then here is where we end up installing it if we're running it on our machines. So I will go over doing this on your own machines. I'm just going to be using Code Sandbox for now just to demo it. So in this case, I just type in that I want Express, and we want it at the latest version. And now if I look in my dependencies, you can see right here Express is installed. So in this case, you guys probably want it a little bit bigger so that it's easier to see on no. Okay. So can the Express module. So as I said, Express is going to be wrapping around HTTP. In their guides, they do have a lot of good examples on how to get going with it for the first time. So in here, you can ignore this part that's right here. This is just showing what version Express is currently at. But you end up requiring an Express, and then you create a variable called app, which is creating an Express. It's calling the constructor on Express and creating a variable. And then the port, which is going to be 3000. So in this case, if we wanted to just take the code that's right here and copy it into our sandbox and save that. Now if I refresh here, it should say, oh, by default, you do have to use port 8080 when using Code Sandbox. Otherwise, you can use, as I said, whatever port that you want. So here it is saying hello world. So the reason why we use Express is it handles a lot of very low-level stuff that you would be doing on the server for you. Last week, we had to manually set headers of saying what type of content that we're going to be sending to the user. However, when we're using Express, it handles a lot of that for us. So in here, we're sending, when we go to just the default index, we end up responding back hello world. But if we wanted to add another, what is called a route, we can end up making it easier to being able to access different parts of our application. So in here, if we wanted to get, say, /users, which again gets a request and response, and we send back user page. So as you can see now, when we go to the application, it still says hello users, or sorry, hello world, but if we go to /users at the end, it is our user page. So this is the way that you would set up your routing for your application. So that way, as you go to different parts, it responds back with different content. So as you guys can tell, nobody is, well, I hope nobody is writing HTML in the browser like this. You're not going to be constantly using res.send. Typically, what you will end up doing is creating a view that ends up getting required in. So this is just for the first purposes of being able to have up our different routing. So what we can do is it.
You make like an HTML called index or whatever, and then just app.get index, and then that's where it show up instead of writing all HTML.
Correct. Yeah. So you would write your HTML file, or in other cases, there's EJS files, PUG files, whatever you're using, and then you would end up sending that file to the user. So there's a couple different ways to do that. We're going to be using what's called express generator, which will do a quick project, kind of like boilerplate of what we're going to be using. So that way we don't have to do this every single time. So let's see, it is 12:47. I guess I'll quickly go over express generator, and then we'll go for a quick 15-minute break or so. So express generator sets up a good boilerplate for your application. They have a lot of different settings, as you can see right here. They have /help, so that way it kind of gives you help on how to use the utility. You can check the version number, and then they have these different kind of things that are here. They have EJS EBS, Pug, Hogan, no view. And what these are for is the templating engine. So this is when you end up passing variables to a view to render it on the page. These are the different types of ways that you can do it. EJS is has a similar syntax to PHP. Handlebars uses curly braces and then references a variable. Pug is all, well, they're all different, let's say that. We're probably going to be using Pug as it's the one that I am most familiar with and I like the most because it has the cleanest HTML look to it. So when you end up running the command, this is what it ends up doing. It creates a bunch of files for you. So it'll create a folder, package.json, so that way you don't have to write npm init on your project. It creates an app.js, a public folder, a routes folder, a views folder. If anyone, I'm sure you might be a little bit familiar, it's kind of like model view controller. So in this case, the route is going to be your controller where you handle any sort of, getting information from a database. Your view is just a view, model view controller, and is what is used to display that information. So you would pass the variables from the controller, or in this case, the route, into the view, and then that would display it. And then you have public, which is just going to be where any custom JavaScript or any sort of images are done. And by default, which is actually kind of nice, your public folder will be accessible. So by default, you don't have to end up allowing the public folder to be accessed. And it is what is called a static folder. So typically, you don't have a lot of stuff that's changing in here, whereas your route is going to be where a lot of your core code that is dynamic is going to be. And then it creates a bin file or bin folder with a file called www, which when I ended up doing this, you usually end up changing that because it's not very helpful. Really, we just call it server.js. So that's where all of your server code is going to be, and your app is where the Express app lives, or you could call it index.js. So with that being said, is there any questions on how Express, or at least Express Generator, is going to be working? No? All right. So so in here, I'm going to create, well, actually, first I'm going to install Express Generator globally. So that just installed it globally, and then I can do, in here, they have the command of Express, and then we're going to be specifying Pug. So in here, you just do Express, and then I believe it's space the name of your application. So in here, we're going to do _view equals Pug.
Are we supposed to be following along while you're doing this?
Don't have to right now. I'm just kind of showing what it's going to scaffold out. So in this case, we'll just do week 2. And if I were to open that folder, you can see this is the application kind of already scaffolded out of everything. So if I wanted to open that into my editor, you can see here that we have, this is the index file. So Pug is a little bit different compared to most templating engines that you guys are going to be familiar with. In this case, it's all white space sensitive. So in this case, we have a block. It might be better to show layout. So as you guys know, an HTML file by default to be considered valid has to have a doc type HTML at the top, and then you have your HTML tag, head, body, stuff like that. So in this case, because head is tabbed in, it is a child of HTML. And because title is tabbed in from head, it's a title of, or child of head, so on and so forth. So if you wanted to end up creating more and more stuff, it's just kind of tab based. which when we start getting into class naming and stuff like that, you'll really see where Pug starts to shine in regards to mockup, or into markup, not mockup. So now I know that I'm dealing with a bunch of designers, but who is really against using Bootstrap? You guys aren't against Bootstrap? Cool, we're gonna be using Bootstrap. So Bootstrap, as you guys know, has a bunch of class names for it. You have like container, you can end up using like small 1, small 2, so that way you have your grid pattern for it. And it comes with a bunch of really easy to use classes. So in this case, I'm gonna actually start up this. Oh. Nope. Okay, so when you use Express Generator, you have to install all of your modules that come with it, which there are a bunch that come with it from default, and then you can start your server. So in this case, it just actually runs the command node on our bin www file, which, as I said, is kind of like our index or server.js file. So if I were to open that up here, this is not actually what it is. I just have a service worker that is registering stuff. Okay, so that's better. So this is what it scaffolds out by default. You have your Express application, and I think it also does, yeah, it does a /user route, or /users, where it also says that it responds with a resource. So as you can see, a lot of this is already done for you by default, which makes it really easy to being able to just get started on a project. So if we were to include Bootstrap into our project, you can just go to Bootstrap's website, documentation, and you can grab the CSS. So in this case, because when I'm using Pug, everything comes off of a layout. So in here, we just want our layout. So there's the CSS, and then we have the JavaScript. So I'll go over how this works in just a little bit. So now in here, we can just create a container. Oh, that won't actually change. So here's actually a good example of one of the downfalls of just using Node by itself. When you make a change to the server, it doesn't update. Because typically when you're running it on a server, you're not going to want it to update because there's not going to be updates when you're running it on the server. However, there are some pretty good tools that are out there that as you make changes to your files, they will watch them and then will automatically restart the server for you. So in this case, I'm going to npm install a tool that's called nodemon, which is what I will use in order to watch it. I will bump that up. So now that we installed nodemon, it runs in the same way that you would a file. So as we saw, this ran, I believe, or bin. So this is the command that gets run when you run npm start, which, just to show you, npm start is actually what is in your packages file. You can actually get this to do whatever you want. It doesn't even have to be node related. Any sort of scripts that you start can be run through here. So in this case, I'm going to actually create what is called dev. And instead of using node, I'm going to write nodemon, and then go to the file that we're running it against and save that. So what's nice about Node is there are a couple keywords that are automatically done. So all you have to do is type npm start or npm whatever. But in this case, dev is not a recognized keyword. So you actually have to type npm space run space the new script that you just added. So in this case, we'll type in npm run dev, and this will run nodemon. So in here, if I inspect the source, you'll see here's a container followed by our h1 and then p tag. And then up here, you can see here's our bootstrap that we required in.
Is that a similar tool to live server?
It's not in the same, like live.
Like when we were doing JavaScript, when I was doing JavaScript last semester, I used live server a lot so that it would just update on my browser as I was working.
So live server is probably, did it automatically, when you made a change to your JavaScript file, did it automatically refresh the browser for you?
Yes.
Okay, so this doesn't automatically refresh the browser for you. There are other tools out there that will automatically do that for you. All this does is it recognizes a file change in your node project and will restart the server for you. And as I said, because when you start a node application and you make changes, that code is already in memory. So it doesn't actually restart, whereas this will kill the process and then restart it.
So refreshing your browser won't actually change anything because that stuff's already sitting in memory?
Correct. So when you are, I guess it would make, how much server-side code have you guys written? Like either ASP, PHP, any of that sort of stuff?
Yeah,
fair bit. So when you have the web browser, that is the client that connects to the server. So the client is completely independent of anything that is on the server side. So all this code that we're going to be writing is on the server. So the only thing that the client knows is like a URL and a port and stuff like that, and then the server sends back the information. So when you're running stuff on a server, though, it's typically not changing. It's not always updating. And if it is, that would be more in like a database that you guys would request information of, but it would still, the code that is sitting on the server would still be static. Whereas when we're writing code on our machines, the code is constantly changing. So again, all nodemon does is it recognizes that there is a change in the code that is on your computer, and it will kill the node process and restart a new one, which will take all that code that you currently have and re-put it into memory. So, so I guess that would actually be a good time to take a break. We'll take a quick 10 to 15 minute break, and then meet back here, say about 1:15. So, one sec. No worries.
Usually when you need it, I've had a couple of times where I'm like right at the wire.
Okay. So are you guys ready to get back to this?
Oh, I suppose.
Yeah. So
Yes, actually. I'd love to do this.
So now that we just got Express working on our machines, hopefully, this is now where we get to really start doing the programming of like a website with being able to do like dynamic routes and stuff like that. So in here, when we have this index pug file. So as you can see right here, there's this title that is highlighted. So as you can see when we open up Express right here, it doesn't actually say welcome to title, it says welcome to Express. So somewhere here, it's getting past a parameter called title. In this case, it comes from routes, index, and in here is where, so instead of doing res.send and res.setHeader, in this case we end up doing res.render, which is, this will automatically pull a file that is in our views folder right here. In this case it'll be called index, and we end up giving it a parameter of title express. So if I were to change this to being hello world and then refresh, see, this is what I was talking about, where when you're using Node, it doesn't refresh. So now it says hello world. So welcome to hello world. And all that was doing is just changing the value that is right here. So one thing that we could do is declare a variable that would be like an array. So we could create a variable that's called const students. And we could put in Susie, we could put in Jerry, put in Winston, and now we've created this this variable. So now if we wanted to pass it to the template, this is where we end up putting it in between these two squiggly brackets. So this is considered an object. Another way to think of it is we could call it the params, and we put that right here. So now those are the parameters that are passed to the view called index. So if we wanted to add in students, we could just add in students. Another short form that you can do is if it's going to be the exact same name, you can actually just do that and not have to worry about it. So now we're passing a parameter called students. So if we save that and refresh, nothing changed. And the reason why is because we haven't done anything with that student object that we just passed to it. So if we wanted to, we could end up going into our index here, and we could say, so as I showed you, so you guys know what HTML looks like. It's a tag that has a less than symbol with the name of it, usually then followed by a greater than symbol. So in Pug, there is no greater than less than symbols. You can just forget about it. You don't have to worry about it. It makes it, as I find, a little bit easier, but at first it might be a little bit harder to understand. So in this case, we can just put a P, meaning a paragraph tag, and then we can put in that variable called students, which is right here, that is then passed to here. So now if I refresh, you'll see that Susie, Jerry, and Winston are right here. So because we have Bootstrap now included, we could end up using some of their components that are in here. So let's say we'll do a card. So the thing that's nice about Pug is it has a lot of short syntax if you're going to be using common elements. So by default, if you don't specify, well, let me give this first. So let's see. Under utilities, there should be text, and then there should be some sort of coloring, or we'll do uppercase. So as you can see right here, Susie, Jerry, and Winston is in proper case, separated by a comma. But if we wanted to make it so that they're all uppercase, we could just use Bootstrap's handy class, where we end up doing a period. Period, text, uppercase. So if anyone has ever worked with like jQuery or other in CSS, you know that when you're targeting a class name, you use a period, meaning that it's a class name. And then same thing, if it's an ID, you use the pound symbol. So in this case, we end up having a paragraph with the class name of text uppercase. So if I save that, refresh, you'll see that those are now all uppercase. And if I inspect the element just to show you, you'll see this is a paragraph tag with the class of text uppercase. So it makes it a little bit easier in your markup, makes it a little bit cleaner so you don't have all of this greater than, less than, nesting, all that sort of stuff. But the thing is we still only have the students all grouped together. It would be really convenient if we could just iterate over it, which you can. So the documentation for PugJS is pugjs.org, where it gives you some pretty good stuff for being able to go over. So they have, on the right side, they have an iteration, and this is for going over variables, or like iterating over like arrays and stuff like that. So in here, you can do each, and you have like a value in, and then it would be your array. So in this case, in here, we would type each, and then we can say student in students. So that would mean that every student that is in that students array, we are going to do something with it. So we would no longer have students because that will be doing all of them, but what we can do is each individual student will put in a paragraph tag.
Does the for of still exist?
The Pug stuff is a little bit limited. I believe it just uses each.
Okay.
You can do some other stuff, like there's while, and then you can always actually just use JavaScript, although it's usually better to just use what they have available on their site.
Right.
Because if you end up, this is a little bit more, but you can actually use just native JavaScript by using a dash. So as you can see right here with this while loop, they end up declaring a variable called n by putting a dash in front of it. And that lets the templating engine know that you're wanting to run native JavaScript there. So that part doesn't really matter as much. Really what we're trying to do right here is iterate over every student that's in it.
I just noticed it looked like it has the same effect, so I thought I would.
Yep. So you can see right here we now have Susie, Jerry, and Winston across, or like that. But if the thing is in the real world when you're trying to like iterate over stuff, and say you have a bunch of cards, you're not going to type out that card every single time. So something that Pug has is what is called a mixin, which is a little bit of short code that allows you to reference it kind of like a function. So think of the mixin as like a function that you can call, you can give it parameters, and being able to basically have a function that spits back HTML code. So that is what it ends up doing. So in here, we can create a function or a mixin that is called student card. And it's going to take a variable called student. And this is now where we'll take the component for a card and we'll just throw it in one of these kind of things. So in here we have a class called card, And then inside of that, we have a class called card body. So in here, because we're using a div, you don't even have to specify that it's a div. You can just do .card followed by -card body. And then inside there, we want to display the student. So if I were to refresh this right now, we're currently not using the mixin. And how you can use it is by using plus, and then the mixin name, kind of like you would call a function. So you have a student card, and you want to pass it the student. So again, think of a mixin like a function, and this would be us calling the function that spits back card body with the student inside of it. So now when I refresh, you can see that they're all inside cards, and you can also do some other stuff with it as well. So when you use iteration in Pug, you can also take the index, meaning what part in the array that you're currently at, and be able to do certain things with that. So in this case, let's see, do they have any other special card stuff? We'll just throw a button in. So in here, we're going to take an index, and we're going to do a button with a class of button and a class of primary button. And it just says, go somewhere. And now, when we are using our each loop, we have an index that we can also pass into our student card, and we can do if index, or hold on, if index modulus 2 equals 0. So that means that every second, starting with 0, every second student name that we're going over will put in this button. So if I refresh, you can now see that Susie and Winston each have a button that says go somewhere, but Jerry does not. And the reason for that is because when you use modulus 2, it does a division. 0 divided by 2 has no remainder, meaning that it will have the button. If I wanted to do it to every other one, instead, I could just do a not. So it's not equal to 0, refresh, and now it's only on Jerry. So when dealing with different data types, there's different things that you can do for being able to deal with different, there's different things that you can do to deal with different data types. So in this case, we just have a student card. But we could end up creating, say, an object. So right now we're giving it just a title and just students. But if we wanted to take some more information, let's say, let's do some class information. So we could do a course title, which is Advanced Server-Side Scripting. We could do a code, which is going to be COMP2106. We could do room number, which is 110. We could do a building, which is M building. We could do the, sure. How many people are in here?
14, including myself.
12.
All right, we have 14 people.
Right. All I know is that there were a couple of guys here, they left, haven't come back yet.
And then what else? We could do one more thing. We could do campus. Because Georgian College has multiple campuses, we could just say Georgian College, and we'll say Barrie. So now if we wanted to pass that class information, we just put it inside this params object that we have right here that houses all of the information. So inside our pug file in here, this is where we now have class information, which if I were to render this out, usually just ends up spitting out in brackets, object, object. So you'll see right there, object, object. So the reason for that is because the default behavior of when you stringify to, or actually not when you stringify, but when you try to print it out, it just spits out the object type, which is just an object. But if we wanted to access specific variables inside of it, such as, we'll do a course title. And we can actually, you want to what? Let's replace the title in both of those places. So we're referencing class information.course title. And when I refresh, now it's advanced server-side scripting. And we can do some more stuff with like the class size and all that other sort of.
If you wanted to print the whole
If you wanted to print the entire thing, you could end up doing so that's it, spitting out everything that is in it. And then obviously it doesn't format it in that way.
you could splice it, right, if you wanted to.
Well, instead of stringifying it, which might not necessarily be as useful, you can see here is how they iterate over keys and values inside an object. So we could do the exact same thing that we did for the array, but doing it on an object.
Right.
So in this case, we would have each key and value in class information, and we'll do a paragraph that is the key followed by a colon and then the value. And then I'll just put this back to being class information.course title. So now this should iterate over all the keys and values that are in that object, and then being able to do it here. So, oh, I did that backwards. It actually goes value and then key. There we go. So now we have the course title, room number, building, class size, campus. So as you guys can see, dealing with different data types, you can display a lot of information probably really easily, which actually makes having a almost static site, it wouldn't be a static site, but you could end up writing a lot of markup, or not markup, but like a JSON file that you could then iterate over to have your different pages. So this is now what is responded back to the user, but maybe we might want to do some more complicated stuff that's on the server. Anyone have an idea of something that they would want to do with any sort of data at all?
We could sort the data.
All right, let's do that. Okay, so on the server end, we're passing all this. So let's have an array of numbers. So array of numbers, and let's go 3, 8, 4, 1, 100, 67, 32, 999, and 5. So there's a couple different ways that we could handle this. We could either handle it on the server end, which would make the most sense. So usually inside of your controller, or what is called a route, that's where you handle all of your data manipulation. The only difference is on the server end, or in your view file, is where you would end up displaying it. So you would still iterate over it, over each element, but if you wanted to do sorting, you wouldn't do that in your view file, because that wouldn't make sense for where you would do it. So in this case, sorting might not be, Also, let's do that. Might not be the best example because we could just do array of numbers dot sort, and this returns a new object. So we could just do that, pass it in, and we'll just put it right here. Array of numbers. So this actually did a number sort, like a string sort. So that one obviously is not the most useful because it just took the first character. So in this case, we can actually just do, so I guess this comes into better looking up array sort, MDN. So MDN is Mozilla's developer network. I think that's what MDN stands for. And they have a lot of good documentation on how to use JavaScript. So array is a data type, I guess, or not a data type, but anyway. So, but it has all the properties that are on an array. So you have for each, flat map, find index, all these sort of different things. In this case, we're looking at sort. So how sort works is it sorts the elements in the array in place and returns the array. So in this case, it will return a newly, it can return a newly sorted array, or you can just do it like this. So, but it has a callback that is optional, but is usually the most used. So it has a compare function. So it has the first element and a second element. So it has some examples down here where it ends up doing a comparison. So if you were wanting to do it with numbers, you get A and B, and then you end up just doing a return of A and B. So as you can see up above, if A is less than B by some ordering criteria, it returns -1. And if A is greater than B by some ordering criteria, it just returns 1. And then if they're equal, it returns 0. And what that means is it knows which element should come before each other. So if A is less than B, return -1, meaning that B should come before A. And if A is greater than B, return 1, meaning that A should come before B. And returning 0 just means don't worry about it, they're the same. Like if they are the same, it doesn't. You could probably just return 1 or -1. You won't really see a difference, but it's usually safe to say just return 0, don't move them, don't do anything. So on the server, we're going to get, so now we have sort, and we have A and B. And now we can do A minus B. And when I open it up on the server, you'll see now that everything is done in order. 1, 3, 4, 5, 8, 32, blah, blah, blah. So a good use case of what you would usually do is on here on the server is where you would then request data from the database. And then if there's any sort of additional stuff that you need to do after the fact, just to make it easier for like to do programming, you can do those calculations on the server and then pass that to the view. So have you guys gone over in you guys took a database class, yes? First normal form, does that ring a bell to anyone? So first normal form is where you basically just keep the most basic amount of information as possible. So for a campus, in here, we have Georgian College and Barrie. So we might not actually have it as Georgian College Barrie. We might have a campus of Barrie, and we might have a college of Georgian College. And then in here, when we end up displaying the information, we might want to actually take college and campus to being the exact same thing, kind of merging it together. So when we do that, we could end up saying, so class information dot college plus, and then we want to do a space, or actually let's do a dash, and then plus class information dot campus. So now that means that we've just taken class information and given it an additional key of full college name, which will take these two values and concat them together. So that way, when we're in here, we can end up getting that information together. So you can see when you take different information, you can end up working with it, playing with it. So that way you can display it on the client side. So with that being said, let's see, what's something else that we could do?
Use string interpolation.
Mm-hmm. So in JavaScript, there's, I'm sure as you guys know, in programming, there's a lot of different ways that you can do stuff, either in web or actual programming on like client or server-side stuff. So in JavaScript, there's a couple different things that make life easier, at least I find. So there's destructuring, which is a way of being able to take certain elements out of a object or an array. There's also, so I'll quickly show you that one. So in this case, we can create a variable. It's called college. And we can create a variable that's called campus. And you can see that I end up putting these between two squiggly brackets. So this is basically meaning inside this object, I want to take out these two values. And I want to take that from class information. So in this case, if I were to actually reference college or campus, it would come both from the class information. And then instead of doing this addition of, we can do a backtick, and we can say college, campus, if I can spell. So in here, as you can see, that's dramatically shortened down the amount of code that's there. You can see that college comes from the class information. And usually you wouldn't be declaring this and then referencing just outside of it. That wouldn't make as much sense. But if you know typically that you've made an API call or connected to a database and gotten information, you can say, give me this class. And it comes back and you're like, I want to just take the college and the campus and do a little putting them side by side just to make it easier for me as the developer. So then you just take out those two values that it's right here. So grab values from class information. And then here, we've used the backtick. So instead of using a single quote or a double quote, we can use a backtick and actually use variables that are inside of it. And then, of course, we just add that to college full name. And now when I refresh, it will look the exact same because we haven't changed anything.
And of course, you can just throw text in there, same as you could before. When I say before, I mean standard JavaScript.
Yep. So I've just thrown that in there. So you can really do anything. So, and what's nice about the backtick is it allows you, as I mentioned last week, the backtick allows you to do a multi-line string without having to do any \ns or anything. So I could do here, I could do that, throw that onto the next line, save that. And you won't notice any difference just because of how it handles white space. But if I were to console log class information dot full college name and look on the server, refresh, you'll see here that it's on new lines.
That's curious.
Yeah, so the console log just puts it into what is called standard out. In this case, I'm using just the terminal, but you can actually manually override what standard out is if you wanted to console log into something else. So let's see. So is there any questions about that right now? I went over a lot of more advanced concepts very quickly. So, but typically we do, when we're adding two strings in this case, we'll just use the plus operator to add two strings together. That's a lot easier, makes a lot more sense. Whereas using this is a little bit more advanced. But for when you're managing code and having to deal with like a lot of strings and variables and stuff like that, this does make it a lot easier. And also this, syntax that's called destructuring also makes it a lot easier when having to deal with like default values and such, just because JavaScript previously was a little bit harder to deal with stuff like that. So if this, I'll quickly show you this. So name something from, say, the school that we currently don't have in our class information, any sort of thing.
When you put us on the spot.
Oh, I know, it's difficult. So let's say average grade. So we don't have an average grade. So what I can do is I can say the average grade is not available. Because I'm not putting it in that class information, I'm just going to console log out the average grade right here. So refresh. And you can see that it's not available. So, but if I were to set it up above, I can do an average grade. Let's say, you guys are good students, right? Average grade is going to be an A, I hope. So I refresh that. And now you can see that instead of taking the default value of NA, it takes the value of being A. So that is how default values and destructuring works, but is a more advanced concept that we're not really going to go over. But you're welcome to ask and learn about it. We'll probably end up using this, this kind of syntax just because it makes it, I find, a lot easier.
Can you still console log to your browser if you wanted to? You said you could console log elsewhere.
So when you console log, so index.js is what is being run on the server. And as I said, the server is independent of the client, but you can still get it to write code on here. So a good example of that would be we're passing this class information. So in here, let's just get rid of this just because we don't need it right now. Or actually, you want what? I'll comment it out. How's that sound? So we can write a script tag. And inside that script tag, we could do a console log. Oh, I have to do a dot, meaning that everything that's there is going to be in there. And we could just do test. So now, if I average grade is not defined. Oh, that's in here. Okay. So now if I open up inspect element, ooh, that's really big. Inside here you can see that there's the console log. So typically anything that is done on the server end, you're not usually wanting to console log in the front end, just because there's not really much of a purpose. It's usually when you start working more with like front end libraries that when you're using like React or Angular or Vue.js, that is when you start using those, that those will log on the client side.
Yeah.
Yeah. But just to answer that question, so that's how you use the difference using a view with a route. And as I said, a route is another term for a controller in the model view controller. We'll be going over models for being able to work with NoSQL databases like MongoDB. And then we'll kind of go over some more advanced stuff for routes and views. Besides that, if anyone does not have any questions, I guess we'll end it there. As I said, Lab 1 is going to be due next Thursday, or the next Thursday that's coming up is going to be when it's due. And that, to submit it, GitHub, put your code on GitHub. As I said, you can either use Node for the lab, or you can use like front end, like index.html, and then put the script tag in there. So put it on GitHub, and then preferably, I would like if you did it as a private repository, so that way if someone goes to your GitHub, they don't see your code and be able to copy from it. And you can just add me as a collaborator. My GitHub name is just Naismith. I think I put it somewhere. If not, I'll put it on Blackboard. But submit your code, put it on GitHub, and then just post the link as your submission for the assignment. And then the actual lab requirements is under submissions. And then you can see right here is the requirements for the lab.
How available are you normally for Slack? Because if we come across questions this weekend, meaning that it's my first application actually using Node, are we going to be able to contact you over the weekend?
I'm usually pretty good, just because I haven't used Slack in like classroom sense, but like shoot me a message. My email is also available on under faculty information. You can just shoot me an email as well.
Which one is your preferred?
I don't have a preference. I think Slack is easier because it is more for like quick responses. I mean, it's like Messenger, right? So,
Easy for sending code.
but yeah, so in here, you can either shoot a question in general. I really do encourage you guys to use your peers as for questions. There is a questions specific channel. Really, I don't care. We're not at a point where we need to have a bunch of different channels for specific things. But really, I find like Slack is a really good tool to be able to ask questions and being able to get like almost real-time feedback. Was there another question there or just stretching?
Yeah, I was going to ask if for these submissions that we put up on Blackboard, do you potentially allow it so we can resubmit things if we need to? So if you have something due at 11:59, I submit it at 10 o'clock and realize I forgot something, I don't have to email you.
Oh, resubmissions will probably be totally, like, here's the thing. Because you submit a GitHub link, you're able to change the code on GitHub.
Yeah, but some teachers really get...
Oh, I know. Some of them do that. So here's what I'll say. In GitHub, I can see when you do commits. That's a part of it. And I will just take whatever the last commit before the due date is. So if you end up submitting it at 11:45, you run your code and you're like, shit, forgot something. And you push it up before 11:59, still golden, still in. All I care about is the GitHub link. So I don't care. You guys don't have to submit a zip file along with your GitHub code. That's redundant. So, but yeah, really all you need is GitHub link. If you need to, if for some reason you delete your GitHub thing, you can just resubmit another link. I'll have that there. So.
It's already submitted, so I can't submit it again.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll change that. Yeah. Is there a lab for this week? I don't think so.
Isn't that the rock, paper, scissors?
Well, rock, paper, scissors was originally supposed to be for week 1 and then due just before week 2. But because I didn't have access to Blackboard, it's now due week 3. There is a lab 2. It's using Express Generator. Let's see what I write. Oh, see, yeah, this, I haven't updated this yet. So I'll say this. There will be a lab 2 that is up before end of day today. And all it's going to be doing is asking you to create a project using that Express Generator that we just used. Throw it up on GitHub, that's it. You don't have to make any changes. It's just showing that really you understand that being able to install a global module, being able to use that command globally, being able to npm install. Give me a screenshot of it running on your computer in terminal. That's all I ask. Because that would be the easiest. Yep. Yep. Everything is screencasted. Yeah, I can throw that up. I'll probably just put it into GitHub and then provide a link. But for the majority of this, like this stuff, I don't think I'll put up just because it, like, I mean, I can. It's just this part is just showing more what you're able to do inside the route. But as for what we just did inside on the code sandbox. I'll throw that up on GitHub, just because it's not the lab. So.
Yeah, I don't quite get what you're asking for lab 2, but I guess we'll see what you put up.
Yeah, it's so up here. There's like you guys can't see it yet, but it's basically just saying use the express generator and edit. Maybe edit the template. But I'll end up just putting that up. It's going to be super basic. I mean, I don't expect this to take longer than like 15, 30 minutes.
Everything takes longer when you do it for the first time. I've heard that way too many times.
Yeah. Well, here, I'll show it.
Unreal. Sometimes you hear it'll take you 3 hours, fucking 4 days later.
All right, I'm done lab 2. I just have to push it up to GitHub. I know, you missed it. So really, like, it's just using the express command. That if you haven't installed it globally, you still have to install it. So lab 2, again, don't blink, done.
Wow.
And then you just have to.
Did you just say like npm install -p express?
Are you recording this right now?
Express generator.
Express generator? Oh,
Yeah.
they're different?
Yeah, they are different.
Do you install express before you do express generator?
Don't think so. Usually, like so when you use express generator, the reason why it uses the express command is just to make it easier, so you don't have to write express generator. But express is not a CLI command or CLI tool. Express is the framework that wraps around HTTP. So really, if you just end up pushing this up, you're pretty good. So yep.
I just want to screenshot that.
I would like it running. So if you, no, just in your terminal. So we'll have to install, start. There's, oh, see, nothing here. I'm already failing. So lab 2, and we want that one. npm I for install, npm start, and then just send me. Take a screenshot, and then send me.
Are you going to leave that for your screencast or cut it out?
Oh, what do I care? Yeah, it'll be up there.
Just to help go through it
Yeah,
easier than looking
I mean,
at
like,
some resource online.
this is going to be the starting point of every single class that we're going to be doing with Node.
Yeah.
So it's going to be pretty important that you know how to do this. So it's going to be a quick lab. And because I'm also doing it, like, I would make it a more like difficult lab, but because this is going to be due at the same time as lab 1, I don't want it to be too difficult and give you guys a bunch of homework. No one wants
So you are
that.
going to open this up to be due next week?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So both of these are going to be due on Thursday. Lab 1 and 2 are due at the same time.
So the first time I've been told there's going to be a simple assignment, and there is.
Yeah.
That's go home.
Yeah,
Go home.
until you
Once
get
you're
there,
outside
right?
this room, that's when everything changes. Other forces are at play then.
I know, that is true.
Yeah. Yep. Sorry. Question.
Is there a way to refresh the local server without having to type in npm start all the time?
Yes. So that is. Oh, sorry. So to refresh inside Chrome.
Yeah, so like you make a change, you save it, you go back to Chrome, you get refresh and it tells you there's an error.
Okay. So I'm just wanting to double check. So you're wanting it. So I make a change on the server, and then when I come back into Chrome, it's already been refreshed.
So make a change on the server, go back into Chrome, and you get refresh. Because it doesn't
Yes.
update it.
So that is what nodemon is for.
Yeah.
Okay, then
Yeah, it has
how do you get that to refresh instead of
Perfect. Okay. Good question. So I went over that probably really quickly. Inside your package file, that is where all of your scripts for the project are.
Right.
So you have start right here, which runs node on your bin www file. And then I put a dev. You can also just change start to being, you can just get rid of that, have this as start. So you just switch it, instead of it being node, it's nodemon. And when you type in,
npm dev?
you want to what? I'm going to make that also part of the lab. You have to just switch it to nodemon. That's it.
Oh,
I know.
no more asking questions.
you want to do that?
If I do that,
Yes. So do you want me to just go over that really quickly with nodemon? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll start it from blank. So
Call it lab 3 even if you want. Just like you make a new one.
express, and we want to call it lab 2.2. Okay. So now when I go in to lab 2.2, so here's my project. I want to npm install because I want to install all of the modules because by default it does not do that. So now it's installed. If I run npm start, it's running. Cancel that.
How do you cancel it?
Control C on both Mac and Windows. So now I want to npm install nodemon and use /save.
And this is being recorded.
Yep. So I'm specifying that I want to install the nodemon file or nodemon module. And now when I go into Visual Studio Code, under package, I change node to nodemon, save it, and now when I run npm start, you'll see nodemon is running the process. So this is now when, if I were to make a
What in the terminal is indicating that it's running off nodemon as opposed to node?
so you can see right here.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay.
So, and then you can also see the command that's being run right here. And this is just the process of nodemon letting you know that it has restarted because there's been a change. And then that's my console log. Console log is not a part of it, but just showing that it's there.
Does node not stay watching? Is that
No,
different?
node does not watch.
Okay.
Node just runs a process. It grabs the file, loads everything into memory, and just runs the server. That's why nodemon is used. Usually it's installed as what is called a dev dependency. So just to quickly explain that, a dev dependency in here, you can see here's all my dependencies. So when you install something on the server, usually there's a lot of tooling that you don't want to install because it takes longer. So when we install it, you can install express. You save it as save dev. So now when it installs it and updates the folder, you'll see right here I have a dev dependency of express because we don't need to install a library that watches files on the server. We only need it when we're developing on our local machine. So, and with that being said, class is done.
Thanks, man. It's a good class.
Awesome.
See you next week.
Yep.